Welcome back everyone to another Tony Stewart Sprint Car Racing setup. Today's video is going to focus on the 410s at Stoneridge Motorsports Park. This track might measure out at 3/10 of a mile, but the extremely high banking makes it feel so much smaller when you're out there driving it. This is another track that you can easily run wide open. However, based on your driving style, you might not actually need to. The focus here, as always, is going to be to get the car pointed in the right direction on corner entry so that you can hit the apex in the center of the corner, right at the bottom of the track, and then let the car float out to the outside of the straightaway as you prepare once again for the entry. Lap times here are extremely quick, so what you're going to want here is maximum amount of control in order to get the best lap times. As we're going through today's setup, keep in mind that this setup was made to be very stable, and a lot of you are probably going to find it to be at least a little bit tight, if not a lot tight. But I would ask you that before you start making adjustments to loosen up the car quite a bit, make sure that you're not overdriving the car. You really don't have to drive these cars very hard at all. They change direction very quickly, especially with some of the things we'll look at in the setup, such as Stagger. So don't focus so much on being aggressive with the car. Pay attention to what the car is telling you, the feedback it's giving you, and making sure that you actually do need to loosen up the car rather than the car actually needing to be tightened up, or your adjustment to a driving style might be warranted rather than an adjustment to the setup. I used multiple different setups at this track, and this is the one that I finally settled on for the channel simply because it was so stable and I was able to run extremely quick lap times that would have had me either at or very close to the online leaderboard. We'll start things off with the shock values, and here I'm using a little bit higher value, not a lot, but a little bit higher than what I've used at some of the other tracks. You notice a lot of 5s across the board. A lot of times you'll see me use 3s and 4s just as that softer feel. That's just a personal preference. For me, I prefer a softer feel out of the shocks, but if you want quicker transitions and quicker weight transfers out of the car, then you'll use higher numbers for the overall shock values. And of course, you can also adjust corner by corner as well, but that's definitely more of an individual thing. So that's why I keep these setups that I post here on the channel a lot more standard in the values. So again, if you want quicker transfers, weight transfers out of the car, quicker transitions, then increase the shock values overall. You notice that 2 values are different than the others. First being the left front at 8.0. I do that because the higher the number I use here, the more it tightens up the corner exit. So if you feel like you're just too tight on the corner exit, then drop this number down closer to the other values, 6, 5, 4, something like that, and that should certainly help to loosen up the corner exit. Then we move to the right rear. You notice we're using the minimum here of 3.0. That is definitely a preference for me. I like to have as much bite or as much grip out of the right rear as I can possibly get on corner exit, and using the minimum value here certainly helps with that. However, if you increase this number to something like the other values of 5 or even higher, 6 or 7, then you'll find that it will definitely loosen up the car. So some values there to play around with. And of course, as I mentioned, you can also adjust corner by corner, which is something I definitely recommend once you're comfortable with your driving style and the line on the track. Moving on now to the weight settings, maximum left side weight, maximum front weight. The maximum front weight is to stabilize and tighten the car overall. I want the car to rotate less because I really don't need it to rotate very much, because the more it rotates, it's very easy for me to get the car over rotating, and that scrubs off speed. So I want to control the rotation as best I can. If you find the car is just too tight overall, then drop this number to 39.0 or even 38.5, and that will certainly loosen up the car. Moving on to the cross weight, 55.0, which is the maximum value. This really helps to control the speed of the rotation. If you find that the car just doesn't rotate quickly enough for you, and you've determined that you're not overdriving the car, which I cannot emphasize enough, it is very easy to overdrive these cars and to get the car too loose, particularly on corner entry, and start scrubbing off a lot of speed. So if you've determined that you do need the car to rotate quicker, then drop this number to 54, 53, and so on, and that will certainly help the car to rotate more. Moving on then to the front and rear heights. These unfortunately don't seem to matter a whole lot for just anything other than keeping the car off the ground. If you find that you're bottoming out the car, then raise these values. The reason I generally run the front a little bit higher than the rear is because I have a tendency when I'm getting really aggressive on my line and really trying to get to the bottom and hit that apex in the center of the corner to sometimes drop the car a little bit below the white line and sometimes get down on that reduced banking or the flatter area of the track, which can cause the car to bottom out. So raising the front of the car just a little bit can help out with that. But other than that, play around with these numbers and see if they help you out at all. But for me, I generally just use them to keep the car from bottoming out, and that's it. Moving on now to the torsion bar diameters. And here, the first thing I'll point out is the difference front to rear. So you notice 0.95 on the left front and 1 click higher than that in the left rear. You'll notice the right front, 0.975, and then 1.0, which is 1 click higher in the rear. One of the things you can do with the torsion bar is the higher the numbers front to rear, the more that end of the car will want to steer the car overall. In other words, because here we're using higher numbers in the rear of the car than in the front, the rear of the car will want to steer the car more, making the car looser. If I drop these numbers to match the front of the car, then the car will get tighter. So that is a very easy way to determine the rotation of the car in conjunction with the numbers you're using under the weight settings. So by using 1 click higher on the left rear than the left front, it will make the left rear want to control the car more. Same thing with the right rear versus the right front. So just, again, a very easy way of adjusting the car. So one of the very quick options that you have if you want to tighten up this car, if you feel like it's just too loose, is to drop the left rear and the right rear both 1 click, and that will certainly tighten up the car. On the other hand, if you feel like the car is too tight and you want to loosen it up, then one of the quick options is to come into the right rear and increase this number by a click or two, and that will definitely loosen up the car. Now moving on to the preload settings, you can see on 3 corners of the car, I'm using preload. The left front preload is used to adjust the exit of the corner. The more preload, the tighter the car will be on exit. So if you need some help rotating the car on exit, then drop this preload number down closer to 0, and that will certainly free it up. The right front preload is used to stabilize or tighten the car. I like it because it increases the feel I get from the right front as I'm steering the car. So I like to use a higher number here. Somewhere between 2 and 3 is generally where I like to stay. But if you want to loosen up the car, particularly on corner entry and overall, then drop this number. The closer to 0, the looser the car will be. Moving on to the left rear preload, the more you increase this, the closer you get to 3.0 here, the tighter the car will be from the center of the corner on exit. So again, just gives me a little bit better feel. I don't use it at a lot of tracks because I generally don't need it. Generally, the right front preload is enough for me. But here, because we have such a short and tight track, I wanted the maximum amount of feel that I could get, and the 2.0 really helped with that. But if you feel like the car is just too tight and you want to loosen it up, then drop this number. The closer to 0 you get it, the looser the car will be, particularly on exit. And then finally, with the right rear, you notice would be extremely rare for me to use any preload on the right rear, simply because that's going to make the car looser, and I have a lot of other options in the setup to make the car looser, so it's generally not something that I use. But by all means, it might be something that you prefer, so increase the right rear preload if you want the car to turn more and be looser overall. Tire pressures, not something that I've had a great deal of results in adjusting these. So play around with these and see if you can get better handling out of the car. Generally speaking, for the right front, the higher you get this number, the tighter the car will be overall. The lower you get this number, the more it will want to rotate, the looser it will want to be. Then in the rear of the car, the left rear, the lower this number is, the looser the car will want to be, particularly from the center of the corner on exit. And then the higher the number you use here, the tighter the car will want to be. And then in the right rear, just the opposite of that. The lower the number you use here, the tighter the car will want to be, and then the higher the number you use in the right rear, the looser overall the car will want to be. But again, this is a very minor adjustment for me and not something that I see a great deal of results with, so that's why I generally don't mess with it a whole lot. I get a much better bang for my buck by making adjustments to other parts of the setup. And then finally, we come to the miscellaneous settings. There is a ton of adjustability to the car just by messing around with this section and really nothing else overall if you decided you wanted to go that way. Starting with the wheel spacing, left rear and right rear both at their maximum values. And that is just a personal preference for me. There are any number of values that you can use that will work out here. Again, everything works together in the setup, so every time you adjust one area of the car, it will affect everything else. Using the maximum left rear, that is going to tighten up the car overall. If you want the car to rotate more, if you want it to be looser overall, then drop this number down around 14.0 or even lower, and that will certainly loosen up the car. The right rear spacing is just the opposite of the left rear. We're here using the maximum right rear, but if you drop this to 18.5 or even lower, then that will tighten up the car. So again, if you want overall stability in the car, if you want to tighten it up, then drop the right rear spacing, again, 18.5 or lower, and that will certainly accomplish that task. Moving on now to the brake bias. The higher the number you use on the brake bias, the tighter the car will be whenever you're using the brakes. The lower the number you use for the brake bias, the looser the car will be under brakes. One of my favorite techniques to use in these cars, particularly for corner entry, is to drag the brake just a little bit and use that to rotate the car and to get it pointed in the right direction. So using that in conjunction with the actual steering wheel and or lifting off the throttle just a little bit can really help to point that car properly for you. And I use the brake bias to modulate that. I generally use a higher brake bias number here simply because I want to help the car to rotate, but I don't want it to rotate too quickly and start scrubbing a lot of speed. So the brake bias number can be very helpful just when you're alone on the track and trying to maximize your speed. But of course, it's going to be very helpful when you're in a lot of traffic. Moving on now to the front and rear wings. Once again, we're using maximum downforce here, maximum front wing and maximum rear wing. I tried out a lot of different numbers and had good luck with all of them. Particularly if you're looking to tighten up the car. If you feel like the car is just too loose, particularly on entry of the corner, then drop this front wing number to 28, 26, anywhere in that range, and that will certainly tighten up the car. Again, I tested with that and almost ended up using that for one of the final values on the setup, but ultimately I decided to go with maximum downforce on the wings, maximum grip overall, and using some other factors in the car, such as the left front preload, the left front shock values on the bump, and things like that in order to tighten up the car. But again, certainly test out using less front wing, as that will tighten up the car. Maximum rear wing, really no thought given here to minimize this. The only real reason to come down very much on any of the wing values other than adjusting your aero balance would be if drag becomes an issue. And that's generally on the longer tracks where you have more straightaway to reach maximum speed. So those are really the only times that I overall will want to reduce the amount of front or rear wing very much at all. Rear wing position, this is another value that I tested out. For me, I used -2, -3 in testing, and those worked fine. However, ultimately for me, those generally tend to hurt my corner exit and make the car too tight on corner exit for me, and I end up scrubbing off speed because of that. But if you need more stability out of the car overall, the car is just rotating too much or the car is too loose overall, then try using a larger negative number here, and that will certainly tighten up the car. But again, the focus for me just seems to be that it ultimately hurts my exit too much and causes me to lose too much speed overall to ultimately be useful. the wheel lock at 10 degrees, which is standard for me, but I have had really good luck testing out numbers that are in the 8 or even 7 range or even lower. This will adjust how quick the steering reaction is. So basically, the more you turn the wheel, the less the steering input will become for turning it the same amount, I should say. So if you want less steering input or slower reactions out of the wheel, then drop this number down to 8, 7, 6, and so on, and that will accomplish that. However, if you prefer a much quicker steering reaction, then increase this number up closer to the default of 17 or 18 or even higher, and that will certainly get quicker steering reactions out of the car. Moving on now to the steering offset and the stagger, which are closely linked together for me. We're using the maximum of 20 inches of stagger, but you can certainly get by with less. The more stagger, the more the car is going to pull to the left all by itself. So if you find that the car is just getting too loose overall, then drop the stagger number to 18, 17, 16, anything along there, and it should definitely tighten up the car and make the car more stable overall. The more stagger I run in the car, the more steering offset I run. Now for me, at about 20 inches of stagger, 1.75 is about as high as I want to go, just based on the feel I want out of the steering. This is all about how much and how far to the right you want to be steering, particularly on the straights. The more steering offset you use, the less you will have to steer to the right, and the less you'll have to hold the wheel to the right, particularly on the straightaways. So again, play around with this number and reduce this or increase this, and just see how the car feels to you. It can certainly make a big difference in the overall handling of the car just by where you feel comfortable holding the steering wheel and how much you want to turn to the right. And then finally, the rear end ratio, plenty of room to adjust here. 5.5 seemed to work out really good, but of course, try moving this up a couple of clicks to 5.6, 5.7, anywhere in that range. If you find that you're running out of RPMs, which is what would happen to me if I started increasing it by a couple more clicks, then obviously you'll want to drop this down. So increasing this number increases the RPM. Lowering this number to something like 5.3, 5.2 will lower the number of RPMs that you're running. So in addition to the RPMs and trying to get close but not at the red line number, the other thing you can do with the rear end ratio is adjust the handling of the car. So the more you increase this number, the more RPMs, that's going to make the car looser overall. The lower you run this number, the fewer RPMs you'll run and the tighter the car will want to be overall. So as you can see, there are a lot of different options throughout the setup to loosen or tighten the car, to get the car to rotate more or rotate less. So tons of options. Hopefully this video will help you out in finding what works best for you. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more Tony Stewart Sprint Car Racing.